The order had been simple: hold cold. No drives, no active sensors, no communications, no heat signature above the ambient bleed of the corridor's background radiation. We were a piece of the dark, and we were going to stay a piece of the dark until Captain Morn said otherwise, or until the sovereignty convoy did something that made the decision for him. I had been the executive officer of the TFSN Rhendar for 19 months, long enough to know her the way you come to know any ship you have lived inside of by her sounds, her silences, the particular quality of her stillness when she is holding something back. Running cold, she was quieter than most ships are even in port. The ventilation dropped to passive circulation, a whisper-thin exchange that you felt on the skin of your forearms more than you heard it. The deck plates lost their low-frequency hum, that bone-deep vibration that is so constant during normal operations you stop noticing it until the day it is gone, and then its absence becomes a presence of its own. The lighting shifted to red, then below red, to the faint amber of emergency minimum. People moved slowly and spoke in half volumes, and after the first few days of it, you stopped noticing the discipline required, and simply inhabited the quiet the way you inhabit a room you've spent years in, knowing every corner of it without needing to look. We had been running cold for 11 days. I was at my station on the combat bridge, the forward tier, starboard console, where I could see the main display without turning, and the captain's chair without moving my eyes more than a few degrees. The main display was passive only, the Rhendar's hull-mounted sensors drinking in whatever the green corridor's background offered and building a picture from it, slow and patient, the way you build anything in the dark. On the other consoles, the crew moved with the measured economy of people conserving not energy but attention, the kind of stillness that is not rest but held readiness, the kind that takes more from you than motion does. 11 days of that takes a certain kind of crew. The Rhendar was a certain kind of crew. Senior Chief Petty Officer Valdez, who ran the port sensor array, had not spoken an unnecessary word in 9 days. Not because she lacked opinions. She had opinions on most things and expressed them with the direct economy of someone who had served in the fleet for 22 years and stopped being polite about it around year 7. But because unnecessary words were one of the things you gave up when the ship went cold, and she understood what the giving up was in service of. Lieutenant Harn at the primary sensor station had developed, over the 11 days, the habit of transmitting sensor updates via the bridge's text channel rather than speaking them aloud, which reduced noise output by a fractional but non-zero amount, and was the kind of fractional optimization that, on a stealth deployment, you came to think of as meaningful. Lieutenant Commander Osai at the tactical station had a reputation in the fleet for being hard to rattle. On day 6 of the cold run, I watched him sit motionless for 4 consecutive hours with the tactical display showing nothing, absolutely nothing, and no change in his expression or his posture. I did not know in that moment whether to envy him the calm or respect it. By the end of the deployment, I had concluded that the two things were the same. Captain Morn himself was a presence rather than a force. That is the best way I have found to describe him after all the years I have thought about it. He did not dominate the bridge. He did not project the kind of restless authority that some captains use to remind everyone in the room that decisions are being made. He simply sat in his chair and watched what needed to be watched and said what needed to be said, and the bridge operated around him, the way a healthy body operates around its own heart, without needing to think about it, doing what it was designed to do, sustained by something that worked by not failing. He was 53 years old and had been in the fleet for 31 of those years. He had commanded 4 ships before the Rhendar. He had 1 formal commendation and 3 operational notations that were classified at a level above my clearance. I had read his service record twice and come away with the impression of a man who had spent his career doing things that the fleet considered important enough to classify and important enough to give to someone who would not make noise about them afterward. He had accepted this command without, as far as I knew, any visible enthusiasm. He had read the mission brief, asked 4 questions, and requested 2 modifications to the standard cold-running protocol, both of which Fleet approved. Then he had taken the Rhendar and her crew and put them in the Green Corridor and settled in to wait. The Green Corridor is not a place with landmarks. It is a long trough of emptiness between the Kievan Shelf and the Sovereignty's outer administrative boundary. 3 light weeks of deep interstellar void with nothing to recommend it, except that 3 major transit lanes intersect within it, which made it, strategically, everything. The Terran Fleet Survey had designated it a corridor of interest 8 years prior, after the preliminary mapping of the Sovereignty's boundary expansion had identified it as the most probable vector for eventual territorial contact. The Sovereignty had designated it a sacred approach vector some 600 years before that, the theological significance of which I had studied in the intelligence package and understood only partially. Something to do with the geometry of stellar positions relative to their founding system, and the doctrine that certain volumes of space carried a weight of relational significance that predated any vessel entering them. They had been expanding into it for a decade, slowly, patiently, in the way the Sovereignty did everything, as if time were an instrument rather than a constraint. We were not supposed to be here. Neither, technically, were they, in the sense that the Green Corridor sat in unclaimed space that both parties had agreed, in a provisional framework that neither had formally ratified, to treat as a buffer. The Sovereignty was crossing into that buffer 1 imprinting cycle at a time. We were in that buffer for the express purpose of being found. The convoy had entered from the Sovereignty's boundary 6 days after we arrived. 9 vessels. We watched them come on passive, their drive signatures, their spacing, the geometry of their formation, and Lieutenant Harn compiled a breakdown on the text channel within 30 minutes of their crossing the boundary threshold. The lead ship was a Ritual-class tender. Large, slow-moving, heavy with ceremonial drive architecture that the intelligence package identified as distinctive to the Sovereignty's administrative contact program. The drive architecture was not inefficient. The Sovereignty were not inefficient about anything, but it broadcast its own significance in the electromagnetic frequencies that the Sovereignty used, by convention, to announce the importance of a vessel before any other identification was required. A Ritual-class tender was a statement before it was a ship. It said, "What comes behind this matters, and you should be paying attention." Behind it, 3 mid-weight escorts in a standard fan formation, holding station in the triangle pattern the Sovereignty used for transit through spaces they had not yet formally imprinted. Then 4 smaller vessels whose profile matched the Sovereignty's administrative carriers, the ships that carried the marking equipment and the theological logging apparatus for the imprinting procedure itself. And at the rear, holding back by approximately 900 kilometers from the nearest administrative carrier, a single larger vessel whose profile Harn could not fully classify, but that had the thermal bleed of something with serious drive capacity being run at a fraction of its capability. That last ship interested me. "The rear vessel," I transmitted to Harn on the text channel. "What's your best read on the drive output ratio?" The response came back in 2 minutes. Approximately 14% of estimated maximum, Commander. Consistent with a vessel maintaining station keeping while the remainder of the convoy advances. The drive architecture suggests capability in excess of any profile we have on file for Sovereignty administrative class. Possibly military adjacent, possibly purpose-built for this configuration. I looked at the main display. The rear vessel sat at the edge of the passive sensor range like a shadow behind a shadow, present, patient, not quite classifiable. "Log it and keep watching," I transmitted. "Logged, Commander." The convoy held its transit pace through the first 2 days. The intelligence package had covered the Sovereignty's standard movement protocols in detail, and the transit pace, neither urgent nor leisurely, The precise velocity of official procedural movement was exactly what the package had described. To move faster was to admit need. To move slower was to assert dominance. The transit pace was the sovereignty's version of neutral, a declaration that this was an administrative proceeding, conducted according to proper protocol, without emotional content. They had a category for everything. On day 3 of the convoy's approach, the lead tender began running the preliminary sweep pattern. Harn caught it on the passive array and flagged it immediately. The cross-referencing geometry of the sovereignty's imprinting protocol, Stage 1, which involved building a layered sensor map of the target volume. Standard procedure. Expected. What was less expected was what the sweep returned. The Rhendar, running cold at 11 days of stealth discipline, presented to the sovereignty's active sensors as a thermal anomaly of approximately the right mass to be a derelict hulk, perhaps 14,000 tons, irregular surface temperature consistent with a vessel that had lost power and been radiating heat for a significant period, no drive signature, no communications output, no weapon signature, no active sensor returns of any kind. A dead thing in the dark. The kind of thing that turns up in long corridors of empty space and gets logged as navigational debris and noted for future salvage assessment and otherwise ignored. The convoy did not ignore it. They slowed, not dramatically, not the kind of slowdown that a military vessel makes when it has identified a threat and is recalculating its options. The convoy slowed by approximately 8% of its transit velocity, which was, according to the intelligence package, the sovereignty's standard adjustment when an unexpected object of potential theological significance required closer assessment. An 8% slowdown said, "This is worth examining, but it has not disrupted the protocol." On day 5, the lead tender and 2 of the escorts peeled away from the main formation. The remaining 6 vessels held position at the convoy's then-current coordinates. The rear vessel, which had been maintaining its 900-kilometer buffer from the nearest administrative carrier, tightened that distance by half. I noted this and transmitted it to Harn. The response came back quickly. Consistent with a shift to coordination posture, Commander. The rear vessel appears to be assuming a closer relationship to the main body. Drive output has increased to approximately 18% of estimated maximum. 18%, still idling, but idling with more intention. The lead tender and its 2 escort ships began their approach toward us. Their heading was steady, their pace deliberate. The tender's reading arrays, the broad midships banks of sensor equipment that the intelligence package described as the most sophisticated classification apparatus in the known galaxy, designed not for targeting, but for the layered analysis of a vessel's full electromagnetic, gravitational, and drive core signature, were cycling in the pattern that the package identified as Stage 2 imprinting, deep focus assessment of a specific object, with the intention to classify and log. They were going to try to read a Terran Fleet stealth battlecruiser that had been running cold for 11 days. They were going to bring the full weight of their classification system to bear on the Rhendar and come away with the electromagnetic signature of a very large, very cold, very dead piece of debris. And then what happened would depend on what they made of that. 3,000 kilometers. 2,000. The bridge was very quiet. UN at Communications had the transmit board live and dark, ready to broadcast, broadcasting nothing, the discipline of it visible in the set of his shoulders. Osaya Tactical had his hands on the console but not touching anything that would register as movement. Harn's text updates had slowed, because there was little to update. The passive picture was building. The convoy was approaching. Everything was proceeding according to what we had expected, and there was nothing to do about any of it except hold still and wait. 1,000 kilometers. I was aware, in a way that I had not been aware of it before, not as a thought but as a physical fact, that the Rhendar was a ship with 8 primary rail emplacements, 4 ventral missile batteries, 2 spinal mount accelerators that ran the full length of her keel, and a point defense grid of 64 independently targeted kinetic interceptors, and that every single one of those systems was cold and dark and silent. Not empty, not absent, present and waiting, a held breath. 11 days of a held breath. I understood, sitting at my console in the amber dark of the bridge, what a ship feels like when it knows what it is and is choosing not to say. Morn said, "Now." The activation sequence ran on a 4-second cascade that the Rhendar's engineers had refined over 2 years of exercises and 1 live deployment, shaving it down from the standard 11-second fleet protocol to something that felt, from inside the ship, less like a sequence and more like a single event with 4 distinct beats. Beat 1. Ventilation. The passive circulation cut off and the full ventilation system engaged with a rush of air through the ducts that you felt everywhere at once, in your ears, on the back of your neck, against your forearms where the cold had settled without your noticing. The ship breathed again. Beat 2. Lighting. The amber minimum died and the combat lighting came up, not the full white of standard operations but the measured red-white of battle-ready, bright enough to work by without destroying dark vision, casting sharp shadows across every console. People's faces resolved out of the amber dark and became faces again, defined by the light. Beat 3. Drives. The deck plates found their hum, not the standard hum but the deeper register of the drive cores warming under power, the sub-bass pressure that traveled up through the soles of your feet and settled in your sternum. The power coupling engaged. The lights on every console stopped being the minimal amber green of passive monitoring and became the full active white of systems fully on. Beat 4. Weapons arrays. All 8 primary rail emplacements, 4 ventral missile batteries, 2 spinal mount accelerators, 64 point defense interceptors, none of them armed, none of them targeting, every single one cycling from cold to active, drive coils energizing, power couplings engaging, status indicators climbing from dark to live across every console on the bridge. The sound was the sound of a held breath released. The sound of a ship that had been waiting to say what it was and had been given permission to say it. 4 seconds. I had run the activation sequence in simulation. I had run it in live exercise. I had run it myself, with Morn absent, during a training qualification. I knew the sequence from the inside. I knew what it cost the ship to hold it, and what it cost the crew, and what it meant when the holding was over. On the bridge, no one moved unnecessarily. Osai's hands had shifted to the tactical interface but were not touching any control. Ewan had the communications board live. Harn was already pulling the first passive returns, the sensor suite updating from the ghost picture of passive only to the full 3-dimensional resolution of active arrays, building the corridor in real time now, naming distances and vectors with precision. Valdez at the port sensor station was doing the same thing she had been doing for 11 days, watching what needed to be watched with everything she had, saying nothing that didn't need to be said. None of them had said anything when Morn gave the order. That was the thing I carried with me afterward, more than anything else that happened in those 4 seconds. The order was one word. The response was a ship that knew what it was, staffed by people who knew what they were doing, and the 4 seconds ran exactly as they were designed to run because everyone in them had been ready for 11 days and was now simply completing what the 11 days had been building toward. There was no relief in the activation, nothing that read as pressure finally releasing. There was something quieter than that. The competence of people who had been prepared and were now prepared in a different way and who understood the difference. What I did not know, until that moment, was what it looked like from outside. The tender was 812 kilometers from our hull when we activated. The distance was in Harn's passive log. He had been tracking the approach with the precision of someone who understood that the moment of activation would be defined, in retrospect, by the exact position of every object in the corridor at the exact second it happened. 812 kilometers. Close enough that the tender's reading arrays, which were not designed for the speed of an emergence event, would have seen the Rhendar's full electromagnetic profile resolve from nothing into complete, unambiguous presence in the 4-second window, not building up, not warming gradually. Absent, then there. Cold, then every system live. A ghost, and then a warship. The electromagnetic signature that came off the Rhendar in those 4 seconds was, according to the post-mission analysis I read 8 months later, equivalent to the full activation signature of a vessel, 17 times the mass of the sovereignty's largest documented warship. That analysis was based on what the sovereignty's reading arrays captured during the emergence, because the Rhendar's own sensor suite was logging the tender's output throughout, and we had the recordings. What the tender's arrays captured was not the thermal signature of a cold, derelict hulk. What they captured was the Rhendar, the full weight of her, every system live, every array cycling, the drive core's sub-base pressure propagating outward through space in the electromagnetic register as clearly as a shout in an empty room. I watched the passive sensor display show me the tender's reaction. It stopped. Full arrest of its forward motion. Not a deceleration, not the measured slowdown of a vessel that has seen something worth reconsidering. A stop. Drive output to near zero in under 2 seconds, the tender holding position on the residual momentum of its approach, and then killing even that with a brief retrograde burn that left it stationary at the 800-kilometer mark. The escort ships on either side of it changed their orientation simultaneously, which told me they had received an automated alert from the tender rather than a manual broadcast. The kind of formation change that happens faster than a human operator can issue the order. Their arrays came up. All of them. I watched the electromagnetic output of the 2 escorts spike in the pattern that the intelligence package identified as maximum sensor deployment. Every array they had oriented toward us. They were trying to read us. Harn's text channel. Tender running Stage 3 Deep Focus Protocol, Commander, Deep Reading Geometry. This is their full assessment capability. Stage 3. I had read about Stage 3 in the intelligence package. It was the sovereignty's highest order reading protocol, reserved for objects of what their doctrine described as significant theological complexity. Things that required more than the standard 2-stage assessment before they could be classified. In 4 centuries of active contact history, the sovereignty had invoked Stage 3 7 times, once for each of 3 species, whose drive architecture fell outside their initial classification parameters. Twice for phenomena of natural origin that their doctrine required them to assess before logging as non-relational. Twice for incidents of what the intelligence package described, with a careful diplomatic vagueness, as unclassified contact events whose details remained under sovereignty theological review. The Rhendar stayed live. All systems, all arrays. She was not hiding. She had stopped hiding. She was simply present fully, completely, without reservation, doing nothing except being exactly what she was, in full, with complete visibility, and offering that visibility to the tender's reading arrays to do with as they could manage. What they could manage was not much. Harn's next update arrived 11 minutes after the tender had begun Stage 3. Reading arrays appear to be in a non-standard state, Commander. Output pattern is inconsistent with normal assessment cycling. Suggests a classification process that has not completed. I stared at the display. Can you refine that? 3 minutes. The tender's arrays entered Stage 3 at standard cycle rate and accelerated through the first 3 classification tiers without completing any of them. Current output suggests the arrays are iterating on the 4th tier, the theological status assignment, but the iteration is looping rather than resolving. This is consistent with a classification process that cannot find a prior match to compare against. That was the word, match. the sovereignty's classification system, and the intelligence package had covered this in the considerable detail of people who had spent years studying how the sovereignty thought operated on a comparison architecture. An incoming profile was received, processed, and matched against the full contact library built over 4 centuries of documented encounters. 11 species, their vessels, their configurations, their drive signatures, their weapons profiles, their sensor output, their communications characteristics. The library was comprehensive. The sovereignty's analysts had spent 4 centuries making it comprehensive. It had never failed to produce a match. There was no match for the Rhendar. Not because she was disguised, not because she was presenting a false profile, because she was presenting her true profile, a Terran Fleet stealth battlecruiser at full activation, and the sovereignty's contact library had no entry for anything like her. The contact library contained everything the sovereignty had encountered. The sovereignty had not encountered humanity. The sovereignty had not encountered any species that had built anything that activated the way the Rhendar activated, with the electromagnetic output she put out, at the capability level she represented. The gap was not a gap in their records. It was a gap in the universe as they had mapped it, and the Rhendar was sitting in the middle of it, fully lit, fully visible, saying, "Here is something your map does not contain." Harn, 10 minutes later. Stage 3 assessment appears to have concluded without classification. Tender's arrays are shifting to a non-standard configuration. Uncertain precedent. I looked at Morn. He was watching the display with his hands flat on the armrests of his chair. His expression was neutral in the way that his expressions were always neutral, not absence of consideration, but the external surface of deep consideration. The face of a man who processes things internally until they are processed and then acts on the result. He did not look at me. He was watching what happened when you gave 4 centuries of accumulated certainty, a thing it had never been given before. The tender broadcast. I heard Ewan say, quietly, "Incoming broadband," and then the tone of the communications board shifted, and the translation architecture began its work, and in 40 seconds of everyone on the bridge being very still, Harn put the rendered translation on the main display's secondary panel. "We have found the thing that cannot be read. We do not know what it is." 12 words in formal sovereignty speech. Broadcast raw, frequency agnostic, across the full band the corridor permitted. No header identifiers. No procedural markers, no theological acknowledgement sequences that prefaced every formal sovereignty communication in living memory. No script. The sovereignty had a script for every situation they had encountered in 4 centuries of contact. They had scripts for first encounters with armed vessels, scripts for encounters with apparently derelict vessels, scripts for encounters with phenomena of uncertain origin, scripts for encounters with no contact responses, and scripts for encounters with hostile responses, and scripts for encounters with every gradation of diplomatic position between those poles. They had broadcast 12 words that weren't in any of them. Morn read it on his display. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking away from the panel, "Open a channel." Ewan said, "Channel open." Morn looked at me. The standing order was mine to deliver. It had been drafted by the fleet's contact analysts 8 months before the deployment, and revised 17 times in the months between the drafting and our departure, each revision tightening it until the language contained exactly what it needed to contain and nothing else. I had memorized it until the words felt like something that lived below language, not a phrase to be recalled, but a thing to be said, as natural and as weighted as anything I had ever been given to carry. 12 words in standard. The translation architecture would render them into formal sovereignty speech. I keyed the transmitter. "We know," I said. "We chose to be unknown until now." Ewan closed the channel. The Rhendar's drive cores cycled down, not to cold, not to the absolute silence of the 11-day stealth run, but to the low idle of a ship at ease. The weapons arrays stepped down from active to standby. The sensor suite retained its full deployment. We watched. The tender did not respond. The escorts held position. The rear vessel, the one whose drives had been warming since the convoy's first encounter with our sensor shadow, held at the back of the formation, its thermal output arrested at the knife edge between warming and committing, holding a decision that had not been made. 14 minutes. I have thought about those 14 minutes more than I have thought about almost anything else in my professional life. I have returned to them in the quiet of late watches and the kind of sleeplessness that finds you in the years after an event that you know, at the time, is not finished settling into what it means. What I know of those 14 minutes is what the post-mission analysis gave us, the partial decode of the convoy's internal communications that Harn achieved in the field, and the fuller decode the fleet's analysts completed in the weeks after we returned. The convoy was not frozen, it was deliberating. The tender had broadcast its unscripted transmission, not as a communication to us, but as a transmission to its own convoy, an emergency theological notice, which was the term the intelligence package used for the sovereignty's internal alert protocol when a reading array returned a non-classifiable result. Such a notice triggered a mandatory collective assessment. Every vessel in the formation had to receive the notice, transmit its acknowledgement, and contribute its own sensor data to a consolidated reading. The 14 minutes were the time it took for that process to run, for 9 vessels to share everything they had seen, for the theological assessments of each vessel's senior ritual officer to be compiled and cross-referenced, for the consolidated picture to be reviewed by the tender's primary reader, who was, in sovereignty doctrine, the highest theological authority on a contact expedition. The primary reader's assessment when it came was 3 sentences. The fleet's analysts decoded it 2 weeks after we returned. It said, "The vessel is present. Its weight cannot be read. Its transmission contains a claim about its own choice." That last sentence was the one that mattered. The sovereignty's doctrine of the revealed weight, which I had read about in the intelligence package and had understood before that day only as an abstraction, held that a vessel's act of revealing itself to a reading array was a declaration, not a communication in the sense of an exchange of information, but a declaration of existence and identity. What a vessel chose to show in the moment of revelation was considered, in sovereignty theology, the most reliable statement of its nature. Masks could be worn and removed, protocols could be performed and abandoned, but the revealed weight was the thing that was real. The Rhendar's revealed weight was a ship that had been invisible and chosen to stop being invisible. That was not a reading array result. That was a theological fact. And the theological fact was that something had chosen the terms of its own visibility, and then, 12 words later, told them so. That was not in the script. That was not in the script because the sovereignty scripts were built on the assumption that the terms of visibility were determined by the reader. You brought your arrays. You ran your sweep. You read the vessel. The vessel might be difficult to read or unusual or outside the standard parameters, but it did not choose when you were allowed to read it. We had. At the 14-minute mark, the tender's drives increased output. Retrograde. A slow, deliberate burn in the direction away from us, increasing the distance from 800 kilometers to the 9,000-kilometer separation that the intelligence package identified as the sovereignty's standard operational distance for what their doctrine called an encounter of undefined relational weight. The category existed. It was an old category, much older than the 4 centuries of their contact history, going back to their pre-contact theological literature, reserved for the hypothetical situation in which a vessel encountered a thing whose weight could not be placed within the known relational structure of the cosmos. They had a word for us. They had always had a word for us. They had just never expected to need it. The convoy reformed around the tender and around the rear vessel, which had finally committed its drives to station-keeping at the new distance. The full formation held there, 9 vessels, everything they had, sitting at 9,000 kilometers and doing nothing except existing in the same corridor as the Rhendar. On the passive display, the tender's reading arrays were cycling in a new pattern that Harn flagged as inconsistent with any documented sovereignty sensor protocol. "It looks like they are attempting to log the encounter," he transmitted, "but the logging architecture does not have a completed classification to attach the log entry to. They may be creating a new classification." They were. I did not learn that until the post-mission analysis, but Harn's read was correct. In the 14 minutes of collective assessment, the sovereignty's primary reader had made a decision that was the first of its kind in their recorded contact history. She had authorized the creation of an unclassified log entry, an entry that did not complete the standard classification fields, but instead carried a provisional designation taken from their theological literature. The designation was old and specific. It referred, "I am rendering this in approximate standard," to the trace left by something that had passed through, whose full weight remained beyond reading, and whose visibility had been a matter of its own choosing rather than the reader's capability. A footprint, the mark of something that had been here and had decided, for reasons that were entirely its own, that you were permitted to know it had been here. They had encountered this once before, 2,000 years ago, before their spacefaring period, when a vessel of unknown origin had passed through their home system, been seen on their astronomical instruments, and vanished without contact or classification. Their theological literature had created the category then, on the premise that proper humility required acknowledging that the universe might contain things beyond the reach of any reading. We were the second. The convoy held position for 4 hours. Then it began a withdrawal. Slow, orderly, the full formation moving together on the vector back toward the sovereignty's boundary at something below transit pace, which was slower than neutral and faster than deliberate, and which I spent an hour trying to find in the intelligence package before Harn texted me that it matched what the sovereignty used for what their doctrine called the return bearing of an encounter record. The speed of someone carrying something home carefully. The rear vessel went last. When it finally committed its drives to the withdrawal vector and began to pull away, its communications array broadcast one final tight beam, not to us, to the tender, moving ahead of it in the formation. Harn caught it on the edge of the passive envelope. 2 words in formal sovereignty speech. The architecture rendered them in standard. Log it. We watched them until they crossed back over the boundary marker into sovereignty administrative space. Then the display showed us an empty corridor. Morn said maintain cold, and that was all. We went cold again. Not for concealment, they knew now, in a way they could not unknow, that the silence we maintained was not the silence of an empty corridor, but the silence of something that had decided not to be heard. The second cold running was different from the 11 days before. During those 11 days, the silence had been a preparation, a held position, a deliberate unrevealing. Now the silence was a statement. We had spoken 12 words and then gone quiet, and the quiet after 12 words means something different than the quiet before them. I understood that. I believed Morn understood it, and that it was why he had given the order without explanation. The crew understood it too. This was not something that was discussed, not then, and not in the days immediately after. The Rhendar went cold and the crew went cold with her, returning to the amberdark and the minimum ventilation and the half-volume voices with the same discipline they had maintained for 11 days before. But the quality of the silence was different, and I was not the only one who felt it. Valdez, at the port sensor array, had gone back to her 4-hour stretches of motionless attention, but the set of her shoulders was different, not tighter, not looser, but settled in the particular way that something settles when it has completed what it set out to do and has moved into the phase of guarding the completion. Harn's text updates were sparser now, because the corridor was empty and there was less to report. But the updates he did send had the quality of a man tracking an absence with the same precision he had tracked a presence. Ewan at the communications station had the receive board live and the transmit board dark, and he kept them that way without being told. We had said our 12 words. There was nothing more to say. If the sovereignty chose to respond, if they turned their convoy around and came back with a different posture and a different broadcast, we would deal with that when it happened. But transmitting into an empty corridor to add to what had been said was not something that needed doing. The 12 words were complete. They said what they said. Adding to them would have been like adding a sentence to the end of a statement that had already closed. I thought about the transmission often in those 4 days of the second cold run. Not the words themselves, I knew the words, I had memorized them until they were part of me, but the decision to send them. We know. We chose to be unknown until now. 12 words that said, in the most compressed form available, we were aware of you. We were aware of ourselves. The silence was a decision, not an absence, and the decision ended when we decided it ended and not before. What that told the sovereignty, what I had been turning over in my mind since the moment I said the words, was not a threat. It was a fact about what kind of thing had been in the corridor with them for however long it had been there before they arrived. A thing that knew it was there. A thing that had reasons. A thing that made choices and was capable of communicating that it made choices, and did so in exactly the number of words required and no more. I held cold for 4 more days. The corridor stayed empty. No return by the convoy. No second approach by any other sovereignty vessel. No transmission on any frequency from the boundary direction. Just the green corridor as it had been before the convoy arrived, a long trough of nothing, with the Rhendar sitting in it, breathing at minimum, watching. On the morning of the 4th day, Morn called me to the briefing room. The room was small, 3 seats, and a fold-down table, and a bulkhead unit that housed the ship's official communications terminal, and beside it, Morn's coffee machine, which was the one luxury item he maintained on board regardless of operational status or power conservation protocols. It ran on its own dedicated power cell that he had installed himself, and it was, as far as I had been able to determine, the only system on the Rhendar that was not subject to the cold-running protocol. He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of me when I sat down. The light in the briefing room was standard operational white. After 4 days of amberdark, it felt slightly clinical, the kind of brightness that makes you aware of your own face. "Your read," he said. Not a debrief, not a formal assessment request. His red request was always a personal one. He wanted to know what I had made of it before professional language had a chance to smooth it into something presentable. "They'll come back," I said. "Not quickly. They don't do anything quickly. But they'll come back, and when they do, they'll bring different instruments, and they'll look at this corridor differently than they looked at it before." He turned his cup in his hands. "How differently?" "They had a classification for everything. Now they have something they can't classify, and they know where they found it." I paused, trying to organize what I was thinking into something precise enough to be useful. "The imprinting program is going to stall here. Not because we threatened them, we didn't fire, we didn't maneuver, we didn't broadcast anything combative, but because the program depends on their ability to read what they encounter, and they know they can't read us. And their doctrine, as far as I understand it, doesn't permit them to imprint a space that contains something they cannot read." "The theological literature category." "Yes. Whatever that category obliges them to do, it's not to proceed as normal." I looked at the display on the wall, which was showing the passive sensor picture of the empty corridor. "They have a word for us. That's not nothing. If they had no word at all, they might react by force, filling the gap in their classification system with whatever response their military doctrine covers for an encounter of unknown nature. But they do have a word." It's old and it's from before they had ships, and it means something like the trace of a thing that chose to be seen. That's a contemplative category, not a threat-response category. Morn nodded. He drank his coffee, I drank mine. The fleet's analysts think 3 years, he said, before they re-enter the corridor in any formal capacity. It might be more. It might. They're patient. Whatever they decide to do with this, however they reclassify it, what protocols they develop, whether they bring it to their senior theological council or handle it at the contact program level, it'll take the time it takes. They don't rush their doctrine. No, he said, they don't. He was quiet for a moment. On the other side of the bulkhead, the Rhendar held her cold-run discipline, ventilation at minimum, drives at 0, sensors passive, crew moving in the amberdark with the measured economy of people who had been doing it long enough that it was no longer effort but simply the mode they were in. What we sent them, I said. Go ahead. 12 words we know. We chose to be unknown until now. I turned the cup in my hands. It told them we were aware that we were being searched for. It told them the silence was intentional. It told them we decided when to end the silence. I stopped. That's the main thing, Morn said. Yes. The firepower isn't the main thing. No, the firepower is what they couldn't read, what they can't categorize. But the reason they can't categorize it isn't the scale of it, it's that they had no warning. They had no entry in their library. They ran their Stage 3 protocol and came back empty, and that's never happened before. But what the transmission told them is that the reason it happened wasn't a malfunction and wasn't a gap in their instruments. I found the words I was looking for. It was that we decided they weren't going to read us until we were ready to be read. And when we were ready, we showed them everything, and they still couldn't read it. Morn set his cup down. That's what the footprint is, he said. Not the fact that we were here, not what we showed them, the fact that we chose, and then chose again. I thought about what the transmission had felt like to send. Not the mechanics of it, I had keyed transmitters thousands of times, it was a reflex, but the weight of those 12 words at the moment of transmission. 2 sentences. We know. We chose to be unknown until now. I had said them in the voice I used for formal operational communications, not flat, not robotic, but measured, carrying no more emphasis than the words themselves required. No threat in the tone, no apology, no performance of anything, just the statement delivered as a statement closed. Were you afraid? Morn asked. He said it the way he asked most things, directly, without framing it in a way that suggested there was a right answer. I thought about it honestly. No, not when I sent it, before maybe. During the 11 days there were moments when I thought about what happened if they didn't process it the way the analysts expected. If they reacted as a military contact instead of a theological one. If the rear vessel committed instead of holding. I paused. But in the moment, I was concentrated. The way you're concentrated when you're doing exactly what you came to do. Yes, he said, that's what it felt like. We sat with that for a moment. The rear vessel, I said, it never committed. No. Their military component was present. They had the capability to escalate. They chose not to. They chose not to, he agreed, which is their version of the same thing we did. I had not thought about it in those terms before he said it. Both parties in the corridor, holding a capability, choosing not to deploy it, choosing instead something more considered. Their rear vessel and our weapons arrays, both present, both ready, both held. That's a better beginning than a fight, I said. Most things are, said Morn. I thought about the convoys, 14 minutes of stillness. I thought about the rear vessel's 2-word transmission, sent into a tight beam as it crossed back toward the boundary, log it, patient and certain, carrying the record home. I thought about the category in their theological literature, 2,000 years old, kept in the doctrine out of what their texts described as proper humility before the possibility that the universe contained things whose weight was beyond reading. The second ship, I said, 2,000 years ago. Yes. What was it? Morn looked at me. Unknown. The sovereignty recorded it. They've had the category ever since. They don't know what it was. Do we? No, he picked up his cup again. Maybe they'll tell us when the talking starts. Maybe they'll tell us what the first footprint looked like, and we can figure out what made it. I thought about that for a long time. We left the green corridor 3 days later. The Rhendar ran cold until she crossed her own boundary marker and then, on Morn's order, went to standard operational status. Full lighting, normal ventilation, the deck plates picking up their familiar hum. People talked at normal volume. Someone in the crew section started music that filtered faintly up to the combat bridge through the ventilation system. Valdez, who had said nothing unnecessary for more than 2 weeks, said something unnecessary at her console, and I heard 2 other crew members laugh, and the laugh sounded like the sound of a ship returning to itself after a long time of being something other than itself. The laughter surprised me, not because it was wrong, but because I had not been aware of how much I had missed it. 15 days, approximately. 15 days of the ship holding something back, and then the something released. An ordinary sound filled the space it left. I sat at my console on the combat bridge and watched the boundary fall behind us on the display, and thought about the difference between the corridor as it had looked when we arrived and the corridor as it looked now. No visible difference. The same trough of empty interstellar void. The same absence of landmarks. The same background radiation on the passive sensors. The same deep space quiet on every frequency. But the corridor was different, because there was now a record in a theological log somewhere on the other side of the boundary. And that record was the first entry of its kind in 4 centuries of sovereignty contact history, and it would be there, studied, cross-referenced, argued over by generations of sovereignty primary readers, long after the Rhendar had been decommissioned and her crew had grown old. We had left something in the corridor, something that would outlast the ship that made it. That, I thought, was what an impression was, not the moment. The mark the moment left after the moment was gone. The corridor was empty behind us. What we left in it was not debris, not damage, not any visible marker. What we left was a record in the sovereignty's theological log, an unclassified entry, designated under a 2,000-year-old category, attached to the partial sensor data from the tender's Stage 3 assessment and the translation of 12 words in standard. That was the imprint we made. The trace. The mark of something that had been here and chosen, at the moment of its own selection, to be seen. The sovereignty did not re-enter the corridor for 4 years and 8 months. When they returned, they sent a single vessel, not a ritual-class tender, not a contact convoy. A contemplation-class observer, which was a designation the intelligence package had noted in passing, but which had not existed in the sovereignty's active fleet inventory during the years of the package's compilation. They had built it, or repurposed something for the designation, in the years since our encounter. It carried no imprinting arrays. It conducted a passive survey of the corridor for 6 days and departed without broadcasting. 3 months after its departure, the sovereignty initiated formal contact through the diplomatic channel that had existed between our governments in a technical, provisional capacity for 40 years. The initiation was in unscripted language, the first of its kind in their contact history. What it said, rendered into standard by the fleet's translation architecture, was approximately this: we wish to formally encounter the thing whose full weight we cannot read. We understand that this encounter will proceed on terms that are not ours to set. That message was the beginning of 2 years of preliminary diplomatic exchange that produced, eventually, a framework accord between the Terran Federation and the sovereignty, the most significant formal diplomatic document between humanity and any species we have encountered, both in the scope of its provisions and in the nature of what had produced it. Not a treaty after warfare, not an agreement after demonstration of force. An accord between two parties, one of which had told the other, clearly and without ambiguity, that it knew the rules of the engagement and had chosen to honor a different set. I was not part of the talks. I followed them from a command posting on the far side of Terran space, reading the briefing summaries with the particular attention of someone who had been in the corridor when whatever needed to happen had happened. The summaries were careful and professional, and they conveyed a great deal of information about positions and frameworks and provisions and timelines. They conveyed less about what the sovereignty's representatives had said, off the formal record, about why the talks were happening at all. That I learned later, from a contact in the diplomatic service, who had it from the fleet's senior observer on the first delegation. The sovereignty's lead representative had said, at the opening session, that the sovereignty's decision to seek formal contact was a theological decision. The recognition, which their primary reader's assessment had established, and their council had ratified over the years of deliberation, that they had encountered a thing whose weight was beyond their instruments, and whose choosing was beyond their doctrine, and that the appropriate response to such an encounter was not to return with better instruments, but to approach directly and ask. They had spent 4 years learning to ask. I have read the accord. I have read it more than once, and I have read the commentary on it and the analysis of its provisions and the diplomatic history that preceded it. Somewhere in its preamble, in language that the fleet's diplomats worked hard to render in standard, and that I believe lost something in the rendering, is the phrase the sovereignty's theological council used to describe the encounter in the Green Corridor. The passage of the unreadable thing, which chose to leave its trace. Not our firepower, not our drive technology or our weapons arrays or the electromagnetic signature of a ship 17 times the mass of anything they had logged. The trace, the mark we made when we chose to make it and stopped making it when we chose to stop, the 12 words we sent and did not repeat. The silence we returned to after being seen, which was its own kind of statement, one that said we had not been waiting to be found but had found ourselves, in our own time and on our own terms, and that the encounter they would get from us would be the encounter we had decided to offer. That is what the Rhendar cost the sovereignty. Not ships, not territory, not their doctrine of imprinting, though that doctrine shifted in the years after, quietly and without announcement, in ways that the fleet's analysts tracked and reported on with the careful neutrality of people who understood that they were watching a very old institution learn that its instruments had a boundary. She cost them their certainty that the universe could be read on their terms, by their instruments, in their time. I have served in the fleet for 26 years now. I have commanded 3 ships of my own and participated in 4 formal contact protocols, and been present at the kind of moments that do not appear in official records, but that you carry nonetheless, because there is nowhere to put them that isn't inside you. I have seen things that gave me pride in what we are, and things that gave me a different kind of reckoning, the kind that makes you careful about what you reach for, because you have seen what reach costs. The Green Corridor gave me a different kind of understanding than any of those. Not pride exactly, not the grim satisfaction of a demonstrated capability, something quieter. The understanding that the first impression you make on the universe is the most durable thing you leave in it, more durable than any weapon, more legible than any treaty, more honest than any negotiated position. The Rhendar left a mark in the Green Corridor that the sovereignty has been reading for 11 years and has not finished reading. Not because the mark was large, though its electromagnetic signature was significant by any measure, but because the mark was chosen. Because we decided when to make it and what it would say and when to stop. The only honest way to meet anyone is to decide who you are before they tell you. We decided, in 11 days of cold-running silence, who we were. We decided, in 4 seconds of full activation, that it was time to say so. We decided in 12 words what we wanted them to know, not everything, not the full weight, but exactly what the moment required. And then we decided to be silent again, and the silence told them the rest. That is what the corridor holds still. A record, an entry in a theological log under a 2,000-year-old category, the trace of something that passed through and was, for 11 days, invisible by choice, and was then, for 4 seconds, everything it was, and was then 12 words and was then gone. I think about that a great deal in the years since, about what it means to leave a mark you chose to leave. About the sovereignty's rear vessel, patient at the back of the formation, warming its drives for a decision that didn't need to be made, log it, sent into a tight beam as it crossed back over the boundary, carrying the record home with the care of something that understood it was carrying something that mattered. They were right about that. It did matter. It matters still. We made first contact the way a ship makes a mark in space by existing in it, not by announcing our weight, but by choosing when it was time for the weight to speak. And what it said, and what the sovereignty spent years learning to say back, was not a treaty and not a surrender and not a warning. It was an introduction. The only kind worth making.